And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 209. Today we're going to be talking about the notion of abstract in photography. So what does that all mean? What's the difference between abstract and representational? Is it an either or is it a sliding scale? This is what we're going to be investigating. We're here live on YouTube. Well, if you happen to be watching live and not the recording, and if you are, then leave a comment. Let me know you're here and we can make a start. Yes, welcome. So today, the notion of abstract photography. I think we're going to have a bit of fun with this one. I feel quite positive. I can see we've got a few people in already. So yes, if you are watching live, then join in the chat. I see Robert says, howdy all from the Natchez Trace Parkway in Mississippi on the way to Franklin, Tennessee. There's a 10,000-year-old trail that has a lot of history. I will be in and out of internet connectivity. Wow, that sounds a bit of fun. April says, greetings all from a sunny Long Island, New York. April says, sounds like fun. Robert says, it's sunny and I'm stopping along the way for photography and taking in the scenery. Well, now that could be interesting then, Robert, because we're going to be talking about abstract photography today, and then I will be setting an abstract challenge. So it's quite possible that while you're along this trail, it might give you a few inspirations for trying out a little bit of abstract photography as you're going. Get something in the bag ready for the challenge. Okay, what else do we have? Susan says, hi from a pleasantly warm but overcast day in Kakubri. Am I jealous, Robert? You bet. I think you're not the only one, Susan. A few of us could do with a nice kind of walk along from on an interesting trail, I think. Yes, here in Castle Douglas, yeah, overcast, warmish. We have had a lovely 2 days of summer. Summer finally arrived and now it's disappeared again. But nice while it lasted. Marilyn says, hello from a sunny Colorado. Yes, sounds like fun, Robert. Enjoy. Sandra says, hi everyone from Birmingham, where the weather can't make up its mind. It's cloudy at the moment, but was full of sun earlier. Nadia joins us from a very foggy Fife. And Meg says, good afternoon, everyone. Excellent. Right. Well, welcome all. Don't forget, of course, if you happen to be watching the recording of this, you can also leave a comment in the down below. Generally speaking, YouTube does let me know, so if you think of something relevant, want to type in something, then you can, of course. Also, don't forget to subscribe, click the notification bell, click like also down there if you get the chance. The algorithms always like it when things are clicked like. What else can we do? Yes, so let's make a start. I know where we'll start, actually. We'll start with the Smug Points Leaderboard. Just we're into September now, so not a lot. We've only had, it's the second week, so second Sunday of September. So heading out in the front, leading the leaderboard for September at the moment is Nadia with 30 points. Everybody else who was here last week either picked up 5 points for commenting or something like that. So, but basically, Nadia's out there in front with 30. And so far for this third quarter of the year, Sandra and Robert are both out the front there with equal on 125 points each. VGs are very close with 120, April just behind with 115, and Marilyn with 105. So the points accumulation for the third quarter, which will end at the end of this month, is totally up for grabs. So there's going to be a couple of opportunities for you to earn a few more smug points if you wish. So next week, I'll mention this again at the end of the podcast, but next week's going to be a feedback session. Now remember, if you stick your photos in for feedback and I use it on the podcast, you get a bonus 25 smug points for that. So if you want to make sure you're not getting left behind or you can outdo your rivals here, make sure you stick a photo in for feedback for next week. And then I'm also going to be setting an abstract challenge for 2 or 3 weeks time. So again, opportunities, 10 points for submitting something into the challenge, but also there's the possibility of third, second and first place where there are even more bonus smug points to be had. So plenty to play for in September. Right, okay, so Smug Points Leaderboard out of the way. Let's move on to this idea of abstract photography. Abstract, we get this. You may well, any of you who are on PhotoCrowd, Guru Shots, Viewbug, any of these kind of things, where, or even in your camera clubs, periodically abstract turns up. but what do you mean by abstract? Because everybody seems to have a slightly different idea of what abstract is. And certainly the kind of photo that might score quite well in one person's idea of an abstract photography competition doesn't necessarily work that well in another one. And I think it tends to be one of these kind of movable things, really. So where are we going to start? What are we going to point? Where are we going to go with this? So what I thought I would do is basically what we're talking about. Think of it then as, well, let's go for the sliding scale idea, rather than there's representational and there's abstract and no gap in between, because clearly there is a gap in between. So I think probably let's start with the notion of art, because we've heard of the idea of representational art and we've heard the idea of abstract art. And we sort of have maybe a slightly better idea of this, although it can still be a bit fuzzy, but maybe it's a place to start. And I thought, well, the best way to start this is to use a couple of artists that I know very well. In fact, share my surname. Because my father is a traditional representational artist. Became an artist before I was born, and he paints traditional romantic landscapes, generally speaking, in oils and acrylics. And so he's been doing this for as long as I can remember, since before I was born. And let me find an example of the kind of work that he does. So let's just flip over to here. So here's a typical picture of his of a bluebell wood. Okay, so Donald Ayres, for anybody who's interested in looking him up afterwards, here you go, Donald Ayres, that's my dad. So an artist for the last 60 plus years, and this kind of common, not an uncommon theme of his, bluebell wood. So what we're struck with the fact we've got a path going through the light, through the woods. We've got the light dappling through the trees. We've got the bluebells catching the light. And if you've ever been to a bluebell wood, you can positively smell it. You know, you can feel that sun glittering through the trees. You can smell the bluebells. You can feel the crunch of that sort of slightly earthy path underneath your feet. Okay, it's representational. You know what it is you're looking at. You're not going to go, I've got no idea. Could be anything. Could be a cockerel. Could be a dog fighting a snake. No, it's a bluebell wood. We're fairly clear on that. Let's give another example then. Here's one of his pictures where you've got Highland cows in Eilean Castle in Scotland. Okay, so it's a good Scottish scene. We've even got bits of heather in the foreground, mountains, Loch Castle, Eilean Castle, very famous castle in Scotland. Anybody who ever saw Highlander, for example, was used in that. One of the Bond films, I think it's been used. It's been used in loads of films. It's got that kind of typical, it's kind of everything you want out of a Scottish castle, with a kind of a bridge going across the small island where the tower goes up. And then to make it even more Scottish, we've got Highland cattle in the foreground as well. Now, does my father paint things exactly as they are? No, what he says is he paints your memory of them. Okay, in reality, there would be the midges buzzing around eating you alive. There would be cow mess, for a better word, that you would be stepping in. There might even be a telegraph pylon or cars in the background or something else going on. He's removed all the bits that you're not really bothered about, and he's painted the best bits. So, but it's still very much representational art. You know what it is you're looking at. Okay, so hopefully then that gives you that sort of start of where we're going from. A couple of comments here. April says beautiful, would hang that on my wall. Marilyn says lovely painting. Sandra says lovely painting. Fiji's joined us and says good evening and lovely. April says Kim, your dad is a great painter. And Susan says great talent. Love them both. Thank you. And yes, that's it. My father is a professional artist. That's how he's made his living. That's how he put clothes on our back and food in our bellies as we were growing up. Oh, Robert Schaefer has joined us from Texas and says, just woken up, sleepy in Dallas. Okay, while you have your cup of coffee then, you can catch up with us while we're talking about abstract photography. So if you just missed that, I was just showing a picture of my father's artwork, traditional representational art. Now, by comparison, I also happen to be married to an artist. So Maggie is an artist, but she does abstract art, abstract expressionism. Now, with abstract art and Maggie's style of abstract art, it's not about any form of direct visual representation. It's not trying to look like something. Instead, it's about mood, feeling, idea, concept, explored through line, form, shape, colour, but not representational. So let me give you an example. This is one of Maggie's. It's called Breathing Wingbeat Air. Okay, so this one, I can't remember exactly what the size of it was, but it's something like, in fact, I think it's nearly about a metre by a metre square. This is a fairly large, 100 centimetre by what have you. And there's a lot of, Maggie builds up layers of paint and she sort of will put some on and scrape some off and gouge bits and put extra layers on, and she's chasing a feeling, she's chasing a mood, she's chasing an idea. And Maggie will talk about the idea of she's trying to sort of scratch her bones. That, if you can take that analogy of that idea of you're trying to get to something deep within you, and it's not about representing a harbour scene or a bluebell wood or a picture of a poppy in a hayfield or anything like that. It's about a deep emotional feeling, mood, idea which she is trying to create onto a piece of board. Another example then, to give you this idea, this one is called The Storm, the Light. Okay, so again, I mean, Maggie's got ideas, and so she's given a title. That title maybe gives you an in. There's all sorts of stories behind the creation of this, the feeling she was chasing, the frustration she was having creating it, the changes that happened while she was creating it. Now, what isn't uncommon is that if you're not used to the idea of abstract art particularly, you can certainly start imposing your own ideas on it. You can look at it and people might say, oh, that reminds me a bit of, or maybe that particular bit of shape reminds me of, or I love that little bit of texture here and that reminds me of. And so, there's many different ways you can approach abstract art. You can get lost in little bits of detail. You can absorb the whole thing. Now, it's not for everybody. Most people tend to prefer something that they can identify. So, and what you also have then is in between my father's traditional landscape and Maggie's abstract art, you also have semi-abstract work. So you may well have come across semi-abstract landscapes. So they don't look exactly like landscapes, but they are still noticeably landscapes. If you think about even things like Impressionism as an art form, it was a move away from the idea of direct representational in terms of outlining everything and making sure everything looked exactly like it. It was more about a pursuit of light, and you were looking for where the light fell, and where the light was more important than the direct representational look. And so there's this whole kind of range that you have of art. And that notion of the abstract. I mean, April said I can see a bird looking down in this abstract. It looks like a rooster. Marilyn says amazing paintings, and that's the idea. So Marilyn's idea that you can see a bird, April's idea that you can see a bird doesn't necessarily mean that Maggie painted it with a bird in mind. She didn't, but when you're looking at it, you end up bringing part of yourself into the picture. You don't really know what it is you're looking at. You're not sure what it was Maggie was creating, because she's not trying to express a direct representation of a horse or a building or a rooster. So what's happening then is she's expressing something, creating something, and then it's kind of up to you how you decide to interpret it. Whether you like it or not, whether it grabs you or not. That's true of all art. For some people, the bluebell wood might be very relaxing, might be the kind of thing you'd hang on your wall. And for other people, it's just not going to do it for you. It may be, feel it doesn't have the depth of emotion that you want it to, or you don't relate to it. So art is a very, very personal kind of thing, especially when it comes to interpretation, but also for the artist who's expressing as well. So, Susan says, Maggie's titles tell us everything about her pictures. Very clever. Well, I don't know whether they tell you everything, but there may be an in. They're an idea for how Maggie starts, where Maggie very often starts with a title. She has a title, she creates a title, and then she sort of starts building the picture, chasing that title. Whereas, and sometimes with photography, you can have a title and you go out and you try and create a picture based on that title. Sometimes you take a picture and then you find a title for it afterwards. I have a funny feeling we talked about the use of all the importance of titles in photography, possibly back in one of the early episodes. So that's art, okay? So we have traditional, representational art, right through to abstract art. Is photography any different? Absolutely not. But we know about representational photography. And there is this idea, well, in a way then, so what is abstract photography? Abstract photography is where we're moving away from representation and recognition of what something is into the notion of line, form, shape, emotion, feeling, sense. A shift from documentary towards art, in a way. This idea of art as an expression of whether you're trying to capture something you saw, a light, an energy, a mood, a feeling. And you'll know that an awful lot of what I talk about in these podcasts, when I talk about narrative, when I talk about communication, I'm nearly always talking about communicating a mood, an idea, a feeling, a sense of something. That at the point you pull your camera up, there's something grabbing you about whatever it is you've seen in front of you. And the easier you can identify what it is, whether it's this is making me laugh, this is making me smile, or I'm getting really caught by the contrast of that, or the line of this, then by understanding what it is that's really grabbing you, it then makes it easier for you to work out what you do next, what settings you're going to use on the camera, where you're going to try and place the light or angle yourself so the light falls in a particular direction, what editing you might do, how you're going to compose it, all these kind of things. So what about this notion then of within abstract? Now, there is a sense whereby you could say that if you're talking about abstract as being a kind of a spectrum as such, that all photography has one foot on the spectrum already. Because if you have reality and you have abstract, which is us moving away from the notion of representing reality, then photography already does that. When we take a photo, the fact that we take the photo from this angle rather than that angle, we take it under these lighting conditions rather than those lighting conditions. We wait for the sun to be in a particular position, or we wait for another element to line up with it, means that we're not representing with the camera exactly what's there. The closest you get to that proper representational photography is perhaps in things like product photography or passport photography. But then in these places where you are trying to create as best a representation as you can, you're very often not getting mood and feeling and these other things which kind of grab our attention. It's just about identification. You want to stick up a picture of that thing you're going to sell on eBay. You want people to be able to see what it is and the quality of it, and you're making note of anything where it might have a wee stain or a tear or something, just in case somebody comes back and doesn't want to pay you for it later. So it's documenting it as exactly as you can, within the limitations of the fact that it's two-dimensional and it's a frozen moment in time. But the fact that it is two dimensions and a frozen moment in time, rather than how we experience the world, means that we've already abstracted to a degree. Then we go in, if you take on something like black and white, when we go black and white, we've abstracted again, because unless you are colourblind, fully colourblind, we experience the world in colour. So by going black and white, we're taking us another step away from reality as such. So we've moved a little bit further along the abstract line. And then one of the key things that photography very often does, where you can play around with it, is shutter speed. We experience the world at a constant rate of time, 1 second at a time per second. Unless you happen to be on some kind of drugs or very sleepy, or sitting in a dentist chair where time does really weird things and goes much slower or much faster. But for the most part, when you so if you've got water tumbling over rocks, you can freeze that moment and all little droplets hang in midair like little glass globules. That isn't how we experience reality. So that in turn becomes abstract. Likewise, you set the shutter speed for 10 seconds and that water becomes very smooth and silky and in fact looks more like mist, which again, we never experience. Part of the fun of photography, actually, part of what grabs all of you who watch these podcasts, whether it's just this one podcast or week in, week out, but what keeps you coming back to photography is the fact that the camera shows us the world in a way that we don't usually see it. And to use a phrase, I can't remember who came up with it now, but one I remember talking about a few months ago, is we don't take photographs to see what something looks like. We take photographs to see what something looks like as a photograph, because as a photograph it looks different to how we see it as reality. And therefore photography is already moving well into the realm of abstract. So what we're going to do now then, so where we go here is the idea of, well, what if we take it further? How much further can we push it into the realm of abstract? And this is where I think it's going to get quite fun. So we've already talked about the notion of high and low shutter speeds. We've talked about going black and white. But there are certain things that things that I've dedicated complete podcasts to, which move us much more in an abstract direction. So, for example, the notion of, let's start. I'll tell you what, there's isolation. When I said, when we look at something from here rather than there, or this bit rather than that bit, we are isolating something. And when you isolate something, remove a context from it, then very often that starts to change the idea. So let's just say we take something like this. Now, when you've spent a moment to look at it, what you notice is it's actually a little sycamore seed. It's 3 sycamore seeds still attached to each other, but they've fallen onto water, puddle, and they're floating there. But first glance, it could be an insect, it could be a butterfly or moth or something with its wings caught in the water. It's not necessarily obvious instantly what it is. It might be to some people, but I think for a lot of people, there's a notion of, oh, what is that? And out of context, we don't have a full context for it. We have to build the context into it. So in this case, we've got the sycamore seed. As we move in, we can start to see where the surface tension is on the water. We then start to realise, okay, this is a reflection, probably in a puddle. We've got reflection of clouds and sky, which is giving it this blue, and more clouds over here. But we can also partly see through the water to the little bit of paving underneath, with its little kind of a bit of tarmacy kind of pavement. This was paving. So it is representational, as in it does look quite a lot like what I saw, except for the fact that when I saw this sycamore seeds sitting in the puddle, I was seeing it in a wider context. I was standing next to a puddle. The sky was above me, the breeze was blowing, the cars were driving past me, and I was listening to the sound of that. So what I've done is I've seen it and I've isolated it, and I've taken my camera down and I've got close into it, and then after I've taken the photo, in the editing I've cropped it that little bit closer because I really wanted to try and get that sense of isolation. That was April. April says, looks like a poor dragonfly died. First thoughts. But when you realise it's a seed, makes you feel better. Okay, well that's good. Yeah, no animals died in the making of these photos. So we're into this notion then that isolating something then automatically starts shifting us a little bit further along that abstract trail. So what else then? What if we kind of, let's So what if you take a look at something like this? Now we're moving, it feels like we're moving into more abstract layers. We're not, again, necessarily totally sure what it is. We're back here, I'm using water, there's reflections. And if we zoom in close, we can just about see, so these are reeds, dead reeds sticking up out of at the edge of a small lake. But you can't see the lake, you can't see the tops of the reeds, you can't see anything else to give you a full context. The other thing is that it was a foggy day. And the mist and the fog meant that everything else just sort of, and it was a very, very calm day. There was no, even though it's a small lake, there's no movement on the water. And so where the water ends and the sky begins, you couldn't see. There was no horizon line. It was foggy, misty. It was just kind of everything was grey. And so a lot of the colour was sapped out of it. We can see the browns in here, but I've done black and white version of this as well, and works just as well. But it does feel really, we are now moving into abstract. It doesn't feel like this is about reeds in water. This is now more about wiggly lines against a plain background. Now with this one, I've deliberately left quite a lot of space. So a little bit of space to the right, quite a lot of space to the left of this picture, so that your eye gets drawn to that part. But you can take the same idea. Here's another set of reeds, also on the water, taken at the same time, just I turned the camera a little bit further round. And here, as well as that, we've got a certain depth of field thing going on. So some of them are getting fainter and blurrier in the background. But we can still zoom in, and if we zoom into something like this, we can see bits of bent reed. But also, I mean, I could, if I wanted, just isolate that bit in itself. And that also could be an abstract piece. In fact, any of these bits, I can just kind of grab. It's not necessarily obvious what anything of here is. What we have is we have a whole pile of lines. And so that notion of representational through to abstract, we're moving further along the abstract here. We can still see what it is. We can go, okay, that's right, that's reeds. Now I've got an idea. It's almost like kind of unraveling a puzzle in a way. Not sure what it is you're seeing. You're looking for the clues until finally your brain puts everything into place. But you can have fun with it, you know. So that notion of when we to go abstract, to remove the idea of ourselves from the representational, quite often the idea is to remove context. We can take a photo of something, but we remove the context. And the more we remove the context, the more we tend to move into that kind of abstract realm. So at this point, think about the episode that we did a few months ago, Fill the Frame. And I talked back then about the notion of fill the frame was where you remove the outline. Part of our brain is dedicated to recognizing outlines. Part of our brain is dedicated to recognizing what's within an outline. And when you remove the outline, then you immediately, it sort of slows your brain down as to recognizing what it is. You're removing away from. So here's another one. So here in the terms of the fill the frame, now the brain quite quickly, I think, latches onto the idea of, okay, leaf with water droplets on it. But we don't necessarily know what the outside shape of the leaf is. We wouldn't necessarily be able to identify what plant that is, unless you happen to be an absolute expert in plants. But what's happening here is, well, for me at least, it's still an interesting photo. It's still grabbing my interest, even though I don't necessarily know exactly what it is straight away. But we've got we've got these lines all kind of moving into a point. We've got these bubble shapes, these droplets, which are refracting and reflecting bits of water. But if we wanted to abstract this a little bit more, we could turn it into black and white. So if we take this and then let's just quite straightforwardly go to gradient map, smooth, perceptual. I can just choose which kind of black and white I want to do. Let's just go for classic. That's kind of changed it again. And then let's take the brightness contrast and let's whack the contrast up, play around with the brightness a little bit, and it shifted it again. Levels, I could bring things up, I could take things down, I could really start playing with that contrast again. And now we're moving very much into shapes and textures. Now at some point along the line, maybe we've lost interest. For me, now I'm not so keen on that, but maybe it was slightly more interesting when I had a bit more detail in. Something like that becomes slightly better. Come back here. So you can play around. You can play around with how much you want to shift things about. But the more we are playing with it, the further we're removing it from reality, from sorry, I can get into philosophical concepts about what is reality anyway. I'm just going to use the generalized sense of as it is we're seeing it, what we're expecting to see, and how what we're now seeing as a photograph marries up with what we would expect to see with our own eyes. And if you like, the bigger that gap, the more abstract it feels. So we can see here then that it's this removing of the frame of reference is really kind of making a sense of, is changing that notion of what it is we're seeing. And then really how we're interpreting what we're seeing. Because abstract then is taking away, we can't all turn around and say, oh, well, that looks like a horse, and we can say it's a good photo or painting because it looks even more like a horse, or it's not such a good painting because it looks less like a horse. It's not about that notion of judging something by how close it matches up to what we would see with our own eyes. It's about now, what is it communicating to us in terms of mood and feel, idea, emotion, shape, concept, these kind of things. April says, love the reflection, abstracts and cool shapes close up. Okay, so if we take this idea then, and to use the picture that I was using on the little cover card for this podcast. So what have we got here? Pink and green with a sort of dark, nearly black stripe curve in the middle of it. This is tulips. So this was taken in the garden. I was using a macro lens. And what we have here is we've got a tulip that hasn't fully opened yet in the foreground. So it's still got the kind of green casing of the flower in the foreground. And in the background, we've got a pink tulip that has opened up. But by isolating any frame of reference without seeing the flower that's actually attached to the casing, and without seeing the flower in focus behind it, we now are ending up with these sort of shades of pink, a curved line, and then shades of green. So in terms of reality, you know it's tulips now because I've said it's tulips, or because you've got a high enough resolution screen and you can read that the title is Pink Green Tulip Droplet. Although the droplet isn't there. I did have a droplet at one point, which I've removed for the purposes of this one. So now we're kind of into a place of what are we communicating? There's a sense of that. This is about that you've got that curved line, but then you've also got the colour contrast. For some people, that colour contrast is quite exciting. For some people, that colour contrast might be quite a turn off. And we're certainly into this realm whereby judgment as to how effective it is, or rather what it's doing for you, what you're communicating, is now becoming much more fuzzy. Because it's now so much more to do with what the person who's viewing it is bringing to it. If you happen to have a love for pink and green, this might really do it for you. If you find that actually, pink just doesn't do it for me, and oh my God, pink and green is like the worst colour clash, can you imagine having a living room like that? Right? Although somebody else might go, woohoo! And this is it. So it makes it sometimes harder to judge. And maybe this is why camera clubs, I think, maybe don't tend to do abstract quite as often, is because it is a harder kind of judging level. But you do see it cropping up on the likes of these internet ones quite often. So we really are kind of, moving into a realm of abstract there. Or April says, oh, wow, I was wondering what that abstract was. Another point where we become abstract is actually the notion of silhouette. So the opposite of filling the frame, which is where we can see the content but we can't see the outline, is silhouette, where we can see the outline but we can't see the middle of it. So if we take something like this, now this silhouette of the dandelion clock at sunset, we can see that it's a dandelion clock. We can tell by the outline, we can see the seed head and what have you, but we can't, there's no colour in it that we can make out. There's no, we can't see, we can see the edges of the ridges that sit in the little seeds, but we can't see the whole, anything in the middle here is actually the only bits that are sort of slightly lighter patches is actually just the outer focus bit that's in the foreground of the seed heads here, which aren't in focus. And so this then, and then what I've also done with this is you're not seeing the whole thing, you're seeing part of it. So it is still identifiable as a dandelion clock, but we have definitely moved into the realms of abstract because you're not seeing the whole thing. You're not seeing it either physically, you're not seeing that, we don't have the whole of it there, but you're also not able to make out any of the detail. So the brain is again filling in. I have to, as a viewer, bring myself to the picture. It's not just handed to me as a, this is what it is. I've got to do a level of interpretation. And I think with an abstract, quite often there is that notion that the viewer has to sort of do something with it. So another aspect, we've already kind of seen it here, another aspect of where you're getting abstract is when we go macro. Okay, so if we go to something like this, now this is frost. In fact, it's frost on top of frost. Back during the winter, when we had a frosty day and all the there was frost build up on the fences and on the grass, and on the fence I noticed there was a little kind of layer of about 2 or 3 millimeters of frost. And then it sort of warmed, before it started to melt, it then got cold again. And then the frost built up on top of the frost. And then I think after about 3 days, there was frost on frost on frost. And I got in there with my macro lens and I went right in and then zoomed in, even once I'd taken the photo, I then cropped in even further with the camera. And what we've got now is shapes. We've got all these little cube crystals. Now, again, it's frost because I've said it's frost. But without necessarily being told that, would you know? There's almost, you can project other ideas on here. On some levels, it almost, it could be like some post-apocalyptic buildings which are kind of tilting over. There's any number of possible interpretations within this. But it's not necessarily obvious as frost crystals. We're used to seeing little ice crystals. Well, we're not really used to seeing ice crystals. We see snowflakes, but we've got to really look up close. But the camera and the macro lens has allowed us to see again the world as we never really usually see it. And because we're seeing it in a way we don't usually see it, we are interpreting what we're seeing with reference points that we're used to having at something that we don't have. So this is where we go. It reminds me of something else, because I'm not used to looking at what it is I'm actually seeing. But that's part of the fun. To go back to the idea of photography, as that's part of what gets us excited, is when we isolate, when we zoom in, when we find silhouettes, when we fill the frame, when, all these kind of things are ways of abstracting ourselves from reality. So, other example then, in other ways of abstracting, is when we use really shallow depth of field. So, if we do something like this, for example, so this is, I've suddenly forgotten. Maggie keeps telling me what this one's called. Rose Bay Willow Herb? Something. Rose Willow Bay Herb. Suddenly I've forgotten what it's called. However, what we have here is we have a dried up stem of a plant. And actually this was down at the side of a lake. And I know because I took the photo that what we've got here is a kind of pebbly, beachy kind of bit at the foreground of the lake. Then we've got the reflection of the lake in the background, and then the where it's blue, where it's reflecting the sky, and then the dark patch above is actually where it's reflecting trees on the other side of the lake that are in shadow. So we end up with this sort of dark blue, black, mid blue, grey. But then I've got a very, very shallow depth of field, and so we've got some bits in focus here, and then they go out. We've got all this beautiful bokeh and little bits of light catching, bits of cobweb and reflecting and refracting. And so again, it just feels completely abstract. It doesn't feel like I recognise what this is. It feels like I have to sort of try and interpret something that I'm seeing in front of me. And I might interpret it in a way that it makes me feel good. I might interpret it in a way that it makes me go, ugh. Or just I can't be bothered interpreting it because it just does nothing for me. So that notion then of shallow depth field also helps us to abstract, also helps us to isolate, remove from reality as we would normally see it. Because if we were looking at it, we would see it with a much deeper depth of focus. On top of that, our eye would keep changing. We would constantly be placing whatever we saw in the context of what was around us. Okay, let's try something else here then. Nadia says, it looks like wire wool teased apart. That's true. That's got that same kind of, very similar kind of feel to it, I think. Now, another way you can go abstract is the in-camera movement, is where you go to take a photo. Now, in-camera movement, most of the time we're trying to avoid. That's like we wobbled with the camera, the thing was out of focus. But sometimes you can do it intentionally. You deliberately move the camera while the shutter is open. So you are creating an intentional blur. Now, a couple of ways of doing this. So sometimes we're doing it where if there's a whole way, if you're watching racing cars or moving objects and you try and do a bit of panning. So you go click and if you can move the camera with, say, somebody cycling past, and you can move the camera with the bike at exactly the same speed that they're moving, at exactly the same angle. Extraordinarily difficult to do. But if you can, then the cyclist in this case would appear to be in focus, and the background would appear to be smeared. And it gives a real sense of movement. So that's one way you can do it. But sometimes what you can do is you can play around with it. So if, let me take this one for example. So here's a set of trees with a shaft of light coming through. And the trees are all, I think these are birch trees. And so they're all quite thin and they're all kind of basically pointing up. And what I did was, as I went click, I tilted the camera up. I click like that, and I can't remember the exact settings on it, but essentially a fraction of a quarter of a second or something like that, half a second, maybe probably quarter of a second, and that allowed it to blur. But the smear goes in the same direction as the trees, and then that creates what to my mind was quite a pleasant kind of feeling. So we can still see it's trees, but this is where we would kind of move, if you like, into semi-abstract. We can see it's trees, but it's more, and interestingly, by removing the actual direct, this is what the trees actually look like, I think this tends to give more of a feel for the trees, a mood of the trees, that sense of them all kind of interlocking and the light kind of glaring. It's almost like you blurred your eyes slightly and you're getting a feel for the trees rather than a look for what is it they actually look like properly, and more kind of what do they feel like. Another version, I think it might have even been the same spot about 6 months later. The same set of trees, but now it's winter. There's snow on the ground, there's snow on little bits of branches, and again I've gone click and flicked the wrist up to kind of create this up-down movement in camera. Okay, and now we have a sense of trees, but we've also got that sense of snow, we've got that sense of coldness. And to me, again, there's a sense, there's a mood, there's a feel of the cold of winter. Now, if it had been absolute direct representation, you've seen the actual trees with the snow on them, then yes, you would have looked at that and that would have reminded you of what trees are like in winter, and you're going to go, oh yes, I remember that, it's a winter's day and what have you. But this, I tend to feel, actually communicates it on a slightly different level. And that's what I tend to feel is quite the fun part of abstract photography, when you really try and communicate something which isn't necessarily about the direct representation. So again, I would call this kind of semi-abstract. April and Sandra both say they like the tree abstract. Okay, excellent. So let's another form of in-camera movement, deliberate, and using the notion of shutter speed, longer shutter speed, was this one. So in essence, what happened here was I was driving and I had the camera on a little beanbag sitting on the dashboard. The beanbag's there just to kind of absorb any sort of little micro movements of the tyre driving along. And then I set it for something like a 5-second exposure time. And then when I'm driving, or if I was in a passenger seat here or somebody else or whoever's driving, whatever, but you make sure you can do it safely. That's the main thing. And this is evening, so cars have now got their lights on, but there's still a little bit of light in the sky, which is kind of into that blue hour. And click, and you're driving, and then kind of going around corners. And what happens is all these light smears happen. And at this point, because we've now got these smears running across the picture, it's now becoming very abstract again. But again, we can kind of tell, you sort of have a sense of, well, lines in the road, that probably is a car, these are probably headlights, that probably is the sky. And in fact, this looks like a bit of a windscreen wiper just in the foreground. So you can kind of make it out, but it's not as we see it, it's not as we experience it. So that notion of intentional camera movement by long shutter speed is another way of abstracting, creating abstract images. And Meg says, oh, that's absolutely amazing. Well, I'm glad you like it, Meg. Okay, so with that in mind, let's what I will do here is I'll just show you a little bit of an idea then of how you can take something and turn it into. I'll run through a couple of little bits here. Some of you may remember back when we were doing playing around with the cup challenge and whatever, when I was talking about that, I did a picture of a mug. So this is Megalicious mug. This was my daughter's mug. So this is this is much more. This is a representational image. Okay, so we have the mug, and it's taken in such a way that with the light coming from the side, you can see the way the shadows fall. It gives it a three-dimensional sense. So even though it's just a two-dimensional image, we have a mood, a feel of the three-dimensional sense of it. Our brain's able to interpret it. We can see the logo and the name Megalicious very clearly on it. It's slightly arty. I could have done this in full bright lights against a white background. I've decided deliberately just to use window light to create this soft shadow on it because it feels slightly more pleasing to do so. So that's the aesthetic I was chasing on that. But beyond that is what you would call a fairly typical representational image of the mug. Now, what I then did, some of you may remember, is I then took the image and I photographed from the top, from above. And as soon as we do this, we've changed the mood. From that to this, and as well I've rotated so the handle is sticking up, so the shadow of the handle is coming off to one side. And it is still a mug, and we know it's still a mug, but it takes that little bit longer. And actually it's less about the idea. What we don't see now is we don't see the logo, we don't see how deep the mug is. We're more concerned here with shape, geometry, shadow. So it's a different kind of photo, it's a very different kind of photo to the idea of a straightforward representational image. So we are abstracting. And at this point, I think I've also put it into black and white, thereby taking an extra level. But then what else I did with this was I decided to expand this and stretch it out. And just using the generational fill option in Photoshop, I made it much bigger. I flipped it, made it bigger, and then rotated it. And now this has a different feel again. And this image is, I think, has quite a different mood. And the fact that I've gone upright rather than landscape, I think also changes it. Whereas this one, we know we're looking straight down on it. This one I tend to feel almost feels like it's sort of pinned to a door or a wall, and we're kind of looking at an upright, because the light, especially with the light coming from above, it looks like it is from above rather than just from the side. It looks like it's coming down. So it feels like it's actually pinned to a vertical surface. Using the rule of thirds, all these kind of things, and the shadow just sort of disappears into darker shadow down here. And when we're looking at this, maybe it does it for you, maybe it doesn't. It does do it for me. I really like this image. But it's not about a mug anymore. It's about shape and form. I'm getting an emotional sense here, a feeling, which is not just about, oh, there's a mug, I like the mug, or it is my daughter's mug, reminds me of my daughter, therefore I like it. This is about feel and mood that's being conveyed to me here. So it's a very different kind of picture. But we can also play with the same idea with this mug by, if we talk about the notion of more kind of macro or geometry, if I should move into here and then we create something like that. Now we know it's a mug, but by losing part of the side of it, it's now much more about shape. In fact, if I move it even further in, so we take it like something like this. Now I'm aware at this point my picture's sort of sitting up in the top right corner, blocking part of this. Tell you what, let's rotate that, and then let's just take it in this side so you can see it a bit more. That now is feeling even less like a mug. We've now abstracted further. We're just into curve, line coming out, bits of shadow. And again, I could rotate this. I've not got it in Photoshop at the moment. I could, but I could rotate it. I can zoom in even further. I can decide just to take a tip. I can just decide just to take one part or another. I can just take that part. You do something like that. We've now just got a curved line. So there's all sorts of aspects at which you can do. Here we have the curved line, but part of the shadow. And the more shadow we reveal, the more we have a sense of what it is. But moving it around the place, it can change the feel of it as well. Does it look better that way up? That way? Personally, that's the way that it does it for me. So, that's really kind of where I wanted to go with that, is that notion that you can take anything, and if you want to kind of, it's that notion of abstract photography. Try and find what's interesting within something. Mostly the easiest way to abstract is, generally speaking, to zoom in a bit closer. Macro tends to be almost built for abstract, the fill the frame kind of thing, because then we're looking at it in a way that we wouldn't normally, without a context. So it's then about texture, it's about line, shape, form, colour, but it's not necessarily about an actual object. I mean, another example of that, just simply, peeling paint. You've got no context of where this is, what it is, other than you can probably figure out it probably is layers of paint that are peeling off. But again, I can zoom in here and just take a section of it, and I can move it around until I find, oh, well, I quite like these diagonal lines here, and I'll take that section. Or maybe I want to do something over here with this little knot of paint here. I find quite interesting, looking like a bit of a volcano or something. Could be a landscape. But you can take something, and by zooming in, you kind of isolate. You can do but you can also kind of, that notion with the cup, when I zoomed right out, that kind of changed it. There's the notion of changing your shutter speed on something that's moving. There's that notion of changing your depth of field as a way of isolating a particular aspect of something as well. So there's all these different kind of ways you can play around with abstract, from in-camera movement to silhouettes, macro, shutter speeds, all these kind of things. So that's really where we're going with abstract. I hope that's given you some ideas and insights, because what I'm going to do is I'm now setting the abstract challenge. What I want you to do is, now, it's probably in 2 weeks' time, or possibly actually 3 weeks' time. I'm currently meeting up with someone tomorrow to discuss a job which can only take place 2 weeks today, I can't do the job, and the job can't be done on any other day. So I might have to do this. If I do that job, I will then shift the abstract challenge to the week after, to the 22nd. If it doesn't go ahead, the abstract challenge will be on the 15th. No. Sorry, getting that wrong. The abstract challenge will be on the 22nd, unless I get this job, in which case it will be on the 29th. Yeah, that's what I meant. Okay. So I'm going to set the abstract challenge for probably the 29th, and I want you to really go for it, really play with it. Hopefully I've given you plenty of ideas of ways you can approach it, but explore it, because it's another wonderful, it's all about the way, it's training your eye once again of how to see, how to look differently, how to isolate something, and then use your tools, whether it's the tools of the camera or how you crop it or even how you edit it, to explore the world of abstract. You still want to be trying to communicate something that's grabbed you about it. Is it the lines? Is it the color? Is it the shapes? Is it the contrast? What is it about this which really you felt was interesting and worth sharing with somebody else? So that then is going to be the abstract challenge for in a couple of weeks' time. And for next week is a feedback session. Next week is your chance to get feedback on your photography. Now, it can be abstract pictures if you want, or it can be anything. There's no limit. It's nothing off limits really, beyond something being family friendly. Let me know, send me your images. Remember that there are very few places on the internet where you can get genuine feedback on your images. This is your chance to get feedback on your particular images. If you're struggling with something, if you've got a picture which you know is partly there, but you could do with another set of eyes on, but you've got something which you think does quite well, but other people it isn't being received particularly well, and again you would like some kind of feedback, whatever it is, send me the image to kim@kimayres.co.uk, or put it in our Understanding Photography Facebook group as well. And let me know what your sticking point is, and I will do my best to help you. And of course, don't forget, like as I mentioned earlier, you get a bonus 25 smug points if you happen to send in an image for feedback and I use it in the podcast. And just a little reminder, if you happen to be finding these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. So that basically brings us towards the end of this one. What have we got? April's wishing everyone a great week. Marilyn's saying wonderful ideas. Thanks. Excellent. Right. Well, I hope that has given you plenty of ideas. Lots to play around with. And I remember now to start thinking about the abstract challenge for a couple of weeks' time. By next week, I will be able to tell you exactly whether it will be in 2 weeks or 3 weeks' time. But you can make a start. If you have any questions about this, if you run into any difficulties, again, you could submit an image if you want feedback on it for next Sunday, or you can ask questions as well. Don't forget, these podcasts aren't just about submitting pictures, they're also about submitting questions. If there's something something you want to know a bit more about information about, then let me know. And with that in mind, I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.